Listen to this for a second. That roar is not coming from a Serena Williams match. It is not coming from a Coco Gauff match. It is rolling across the California desert at Indian Wells, and thousands of people are standing, waving Philippine flags, and shouting one name: Alex. At 20 years old, Alex Eala is turning a tennis tournament into something much bigger than a match. Families have driven for hours from Los Angeles and nearby cities. Parents have brought children who have never watched professional tennis before. Fans are waiting beside practice courts, checking schedules, and searching for any chance to see her. The sound is real. The emotion is real. But the most important part is not how loud the crowd has become. The most important part is how quietly it began. A few years earlier, most American sports fans had never heard the name Alex Eala. She was talented, disciplined, and already carrying the hopes of Philippine tennis. But she was still playing far from the center of the American sports conversation. There were no giant crowds following every practice. No sold-out feeling around every appearance. No national debate about what her rise could mean for tennis in the United States. Then something started to change. Not because a marketing campaign invented a new star. Not because a broadcaster ordered people to care. Not because tennis suddenly decided that the Filipino community should become its next target audience. The change began inside the community itself. One family told another family. One fan shared a match in a group chat. One cousin sent a schedule to another cousin. One person bought a ticket, went home, and convinced 10 more people to come the next time. By the time the tennis world fully noticed, the foundation had already been built. That is the real story of what happened at Indian Wells. Indian Wells did not create Alex Eala fans. It revealed how many of them were already waiting for a moment to gather. And once they gathered, they changed the atmosphere of the tournament. To understand why this became so powerful, go back to the beginning. At 13 years old, Alex Eala left the Philippines and moved to Mallorca to train at the Rafael Nadal Academy. She did not know exactly where the journey would lead. There was no guarantee of a major title, no promise of fame, no certainty that the sacrifice would ever feel worth it. There was only work, morning sessions, fitness training, school responsibilities, travel, losses, small tournaments, ranking points that almost nobody outside tennis understood. She entered an elite environment where every player was talented and every weakness was exposed. For years, the progress came without the kind of attention that usually follows a rising American star. That does not mean nobody supported her. She had family, coaches, sponsors, and the structure of a respected academy. But she did not begin with a huge American audience already waiting for her. She had to earn attention one match at a time. Now move across the world to Southern California. Los Angeles is home to one of the largest Filipino communities outside the Philippines. It is a community shaped by migration, sacrifice, family, and the belief that success belongs to more than the person who achieves it. Many Filipino families in California know what it means to leave home for opportunity. They know what it means to work in a new country while carrying another country in the heart. They know what it feels like to build a life far from relatives, language, food, and traditions that once felt close. So when they looked at Alex Eala, they did not only see a tennis player, they saw a familiar story. A young Filipina had left home, entered a world where very few people looked like her, and continued climbing even when the wider public barely noticed. That connection mattered. When Eala first appeared at events in the United States, the support did not look like a movement. It looked small, a few flags, a few families, a few voices calling her name from seats that were easy to overlook. But small does not mean weak. Every person in that early crowd became a messenger. They told friends that a Filipina was rising in professional tennis. They shared clips. They posted photos. They explained rankings to people who had never followed the tour. They turned tennis schedules into community information. The support moved through families, workplaces, social groups, and private chats. This was not traditional sports marketing. It was trust. And when they arrived, they did not behave like casual spectators. They brought flags. They brought children. They learned the score. They reacted to every point. They stayed late. They waited near practice courts. They made a quiet tournament appearance feel like a national event. For a long time, however, one question remained. Could this support grow beyond a loyal local crowd? Professional sports is filled with athletes who are deeply loved by one community but never break through to the wider public. Eala faced that possibility. She was improving. Her ranking was rising. But professional tennis is crowded with gifted players and stories demanding attention. Skill alone does not guarantee visibility. A player can win important matches and still remain outside the main conversation. She can travel across the world, collect points, and build a career while most fans only recognize the names that television has repeated for years. That is why Indian Wells mattered. It offered proof that the support around Eala was not only emotional, it was becoming measurable. March arrived, and the tournament moved into the California desert. Indian Wells is one of the most important events outside the 4 Grand Slam tournaments. The grounds are large. The schedule is packed. Major champions move from practice courts to stadiums while fans choose between matches happening at the same time. In that environment, attention is valuable. And Eala was attracting it. Her matches carried a different sound. Her practices became meeting points. Fans traveled from Los Angeles and other parts of California with Philippine flags folded inside bags and phones ready to record the moment she appeared. The crowd was not simply large for a developing player. It was active. They knew when she was scheduled. They followed her results. They organized trips. They stood together. They turned ordinary points into emotional moments. Then came 2 details that explained why the atmosphere felt so different. One fan said he only paid for a tennis streaming subscription during the months when Eala was playing. Think about what that means. He was not a traditional tennis customer choosing between several favorite players. Eala was the reason he entered the product at all. Without her, he did not feel the need to subscribe. That is not borrowed attention. That is new demand. The second detail was even more important. When people in the crowd were asked whether this was their first professional tennis event, about 1/3 raised their hands. 1/3. These were not all longtime tennis fans choosing a new favorite. Many were people who had never bought a ticket to professional tennis before. They were not coming because Indian Wells had always been part of their sports calendar. They were coming because Eala gave them a reason. That changes the meaning of the crowd completely. A popular player can attract existing fans. A special player can create new ones. At Indian Wells, Eala was doing both. She was bringing experienced tennis followers together with Filipino families who were discovering the sport through her. Grandparents stood beside children. Serious fans stood beside first-time visitors. People who understood every tactical pattern celebrated beside people who were still learning how the scoring worked. The connection came first. The tennis knowledge followed. That is why the crowd felt so alive. It was not only reacting to a forehand or a break point. It was reacting to recognition. For many people in the stands, seeing Eala on that court meant seeing the Philippines inside a space where Philippine representation had rarely carried this much weight. The flags were not decoration. They were a declaration. We are here. We care. We belong in this sport too. That is the moment Indian Wells revealed something the wider tennis industry had underestimated. The Filipino-American audience was not too small. It was not too distant from tennis. It was not waiting for years of advertising before deciding to care. It would do. It was waiting for a player who made the sport feel personal. Once Eala provided that connection, the audience moved quickly. The tournament did not need to manufacture the emotion. It only needed to recognize what was already happening. And that recognition matters, because communities are often described as valuable only after they prove they can buy tickets, subscriptions, shirts, and travel packages. The Eala crowd was proving all of it in real time. This was not charity. It was not symbolic support. It was not a temporary online trend. People were spending money. They were traveling. They were giving time. They were bringing new spectators into the sport. That is commercial power, even when it begins with family pride. And it was happening before Eala had won a Grand Slam title. The audience was not waiting for permission from the ranking system. It had already decided that her journey mattered. Then Wimbledon gave the story a much larger stage. Eala arrived in London no longer as a player known only inside dedicated tennis circles. She arrived with growing expectations, increasing attention, and a fan base ready to follow every round. Then she faced Iga Swiatek, the defending Wimbledon champion. The setting could not have been bigger. Center court, the most famous stage in tennis. A champion across the net. Pressure in every direction. Eala won in straight sets. The result was stunning, but the way she won mattered just as much. She stayed composed when the match tightened. She trusted her shots. She attacked the important moments instead of waiting for the champion to make mistakes. Afterward, Swiatek gave Eala the kind of credit that carries real weight. She said Eala had been braver in the important moments. That word mattered. Braver. It removed the easiest excuse. This was not simply a champion having a bad day. It was a young player making stronger decisions under pressure. For the fans who had followed Eala from smaller tournaments and crowded practice courts, the victory felt like proof. The player they had been telling everyone to watch had just delivered on the most famous court in the sport. The Indian Wells crowd was no longer an isolated scene. It looked like an early warning. The wider audience had started catching up. American sports fans who had never attended an Eala match began seeing her name. Tennis viewers who had overlooked her rise began asking where she came from. People who first noticed the flags and the noise began paying attention to the tennis itself. That is how a community-driven story grows. First, people notice the emotion. Then they study the athlete. Then the results make the story impossible to ignore. This is why comparisons to Manny Pacquiao appear so often. For years, Pacquiao created a rare kind of collective attention. Filipinos around the world organized their day around his fights. Eala is not repeating that story in the same way. Tennis is different from boxing. Her career is still young, but the emotional pattern feels familiar. A Filipino athlete enters a global arena. The diaspora recognizes itself in the journey. Support becomes identity. Identity becomes attendance. Attendance becomes economic power. Economic power forces the wider sports world to pay attention. That is the pattern Indian Wells exposed. And it leads to a larger question for tennis. How many communities has the sport failed to reach because it focused only on traditional audiences? How many potential fans are waiting for a player who reflects their story? The Eala effect suggests that the problem may not be a lack of interest in tennis. The problem may be a lack of connection. People do not always fall in love with a sport first. Sometimes they fall in love with a person, a journey, or a symbol. Then they learn the sport because they want to understand what that person is fighting for. That is exactly what happened with many Eala fans in California. They came for Alex. They stayed for tennis. And once that relationship begins, it can outlast one tournament. That is why the next chapter matters. The question is no longer whether Eala can draw Filipino fans in Southern California. Indian Wells answered that. The question is how far the audience can travel with her. She has already experienced the power of New York. At the US Open in 2025, she made history by becoming the first player from the Philippines to win a main draw singles match at a Grand Slam in the professional era. The crowd was already loud then. Now imagine her returning with a larger profile, a major Wimbledon victory behind her, and thousands of new fans who understand the meaning of her rise. That is not the arrival of an unknown player. That is the return of an athlete whose audience has grown faster than the sport expected. New York has its own large Filipino-American community. Fans from across the United States can travel there. International supporters can follow online. Every round can become another gathering point. The US Open does not need to introduce Alex Eala from the beginning. It only needs to open the gates. Indian Wells showed what happens when a community sees an athlete as one of its own. Wimbledon showed what happens when that athlete proves she belongs against the best. New York could show what happens when both forces arrive at the same time. That is why this story is larger than one loud crowd. It is about the moment representation becomes participation. The fans are not only celebrating a Filipina on television, they are buying tickets. They are entering stadiums. They are teaching their children the score. They are following rankings. They are becoming part of the tennis economy. The sport did not create that loyalty, but it now has the opportunity to respect it. That means giving the demand enough space and understanding that her supporters are not background color for a broadcast. Most important, it means understanding what the crowd is actually saying. The roar is not only for one player. It is for every sacrifice behind her. It is for the family that let a 13-year-old leave home to chase an impossible goal. It is for every Filipino child who rarely saw someone like them at the center of global tennis. It is for immigrants who built new lives while carrying old dreams. It is for people who spent years watching major sports from the outside and finally found a reason to enter. That is why the noise feels different. It is not manufactured excitement. It is recognition arriving all at once. A few years ago, Eala could walk through many American tournaments without most people knowing her name. Now fans plan trips around her schedule. Now first-time spectators are buying tennis tickets because of her. Now champions are speaking about her courage. Now the sport has to ask whether the next stadium will be large enough. Indian Wells was not the beginning of Eala talent. It was the moment American tennis could no longer ignore the audience growing around her. That audience had been building in homes, churches, workplaces, restaurants, and group chats, long before the television cameras understood the story. The cameras are finally catching up. And when Eala walks into her next major American tournament, the question will not be whether the Filipino community shows up. The question will be how loud the rest of the country becomes when it joins them. Because Eala is no longer introducing tennis to one community. That community is helping introduce Eala to the world. And the loudest chapter may still be ahead. Subscribe if you want to follow what happens next. Because this story is no longer hiding in the background. It is moving towards center court.